In November 1970, a social worker in Los Angeles was processing a routine welfare case when a woman walked in asking for services for her visually impaired child. What the social worker saw next didn't match anything in a routine file. The child with her, a 13-year-old girl, walked with a strange, shuffling gait, held her hands up in front of her like claws, and made no eye contact at all. She was drooling, she couldn't stand up straight, and she was completely silent. Her name was Jeannie, once authorities got involved. They discovered Jeannie's father had kept her locked in a small back bedroom since she was about 20 months old, strapped to a potty chair during the day and confined to a crib with a wire cage top at night. She had almost no human contact for over a decade. Nobody spoke to her. If she made a sound, her father beat her. She had essentially never heard a full sentence of language directed at her in her entire life. Jeannie was hospitalized, and once word got out, a team of linguists and psychologists became fascinated with her for a very specific reason. Jeannie was a real-world test of something scientists could never ethically create on purpose. What happens to a human brain that never got language during childhood? Researchers moved in almost immediately, filming her constantly, testing her, trying to teach her to speak. At first it looked promising. Jeannie began learning words. She strung together short phrases, but she never developed real grammar. And researchers eventually admitted she had likely missed the biological window for full language acquisition. A limited stretch in early childhood after which the brain simply stops being able to fully absorb it. Then the story took another turn. Funding dried up, the research team fractured over ethical disputes about whether they were studying Jeannie or exploiting her, and she was shuffled between foster homes, some of which abused her further. Contact with the researchers who'd spent years with her was legally cut off. By the 1990s, Jeannie had regressed significantly, and her whereabouts today are kept private, reportedly in an adult care facility. In 1981, in a small Texas town, a woman named Alice Faye Whittle, struggling financially and, according to court records, arranged to sell her 4 children to another family for a lump cash payment. The buyers, who wanted children but couldn't have any of their own, paid Alice directly, and for a while the arrangement stayed hidden inside a small community where nobody asked too many questions about where 4 new kids in the household had come from. What made this different from a typical informal adoption was what allegedly happened after the sale, according to later reports and testimony from the children themselves as adults. The buying family used the informal, undocumented nature of the arrangement as leverage. Because there was no legal adoption, no paperwork, and no oversight, the children were left with no legal standing and reportedly no way to safely report abuse without risking being sent back or ending up with nothing at all. Investigators later described a home environment involving severe neglect and abuse that went undetected for years because, on paper, these children didn't officially exist in that household. The case only came apart years later when adult survivors went public with their story, prompting a documentary investigation that used surviving home footage, family photographs, and interviews with the now-grown children to reconstruct exactly how a cash transaction in the back room of a house turned into a decade of suffering with no legal paper trail to protect anyone involved. On October 1, 1995, a crowd gathered along the Canadian side of Niagara Falls to watch 39-year-old Robert Overoker attempt something no one had ever pulled off before, riding a jet ski over the edge of Horseshoe Falls and deploying a rocket-propelled parachute to float safely down into the river below. Robert wasn't a professional stuntman. He worked in construction and had spent years building toward this moment as an amateur daredevil, funding the attempt himself in hopes of drawing attention to breast cancer awareness, a cause tied to his mother's own diagnosis. He tested the parachute system on land, and by his own account and his team's, it had worked in practice runs. As cameras rolled and the crowd watched, Robert gunned the jet ski straight toward the edge of the falls, cleared it, and dropped nearly 180 feet with the ski still under him. Then he reached for the parachute deployment. It didn't open. Witnesses and the news crews filming the stunt watched him fall the entire drop with no parachute slowing him down, disappearing into the churning water at the base of the falls. Rescue boats searched the area within minutes, but the current and the force of the falls made recovery difficult. Robert's body was recovered several hours later downstream. Investigators later found that the parachute's deployment mechanism, which had worked reliably during every land test, simply failed under the specific conditions of the actual jump. Whether from the impact of hitting the water at the base of the falls at high speed or a mechanical failure in the open air, nobody could say for certain. Robert became one of the few people in Niagara Falls history to die attempting a stunt over the falls rather than surviving it, joining a strange, small list of daredevils whose final moments were captured on live television. In April 1990, 14-year-old Regina K. Walters and her older sister were hitchhiking through Illinois when they accepted a ride from a long-haul trucker named Robert Ben Rhodes. Rhodes seemed friendly enough at first, and the girls had no reason to suspect the man behind the wheel had already been quietly killing people across state lines for years, using his truck's mobility to avoid ever being connected to a single jurisdiction long enough for anyone to notice a pattern. Rhodes took Regina captive, holding her for days inside a specially modified section of his truck's sleeper cab that he'd converted into what investigators later described as a mobile torture chamber, complete with restraints bolted into the walls. Over those days, Rhodes recorded some of what he did to her on videotape, evidence that would later become central to convicting him, but that has never been publicly released in full out of respect for the severity of what it contains. Regina never made it home. Her body was found in an abandoned barn in Illinois, and her killer remained unidentified for years. Her case became one of dozens of unsolved murders involving young hitchhikers and runaways who vanished along America's interstate trucking routes throughout the 1970s and 1980s. The breakthrough came in 1990 when Rhodes' wife discovered disturbing items inside his truck and alerted police. The investigation led to his arrest, and a search of his rig uncovered the videotape, along with personal souvenirs and photographs that linked him to Regina and several other unsolved murders across multiple states. Rhodes was eventually connected through his own admissions and physical evidence to at least 3 murders. However, investigators believe the true number of his victims is likely far higher, as he spent years using his job as a long-haul truck driver to travel the country's interstate highways without attracting suspicion. He was sentenced to life in prison and died there in 2019, having never fully disclosed the true scope of what he'd done.